And make sure they start the clock.
Yeah. And Bob, make sure that you'll start the clock at the right time.
Okay, well.
Okay, they're recording.
Welcome to the Veterans Hour, a monthly program produced by the Rachel Corrie Chapter 109 Veterans for Peace in Olympia, Washington. I'm Mark Fleming, your host for this month's program. Veterans for Peace is a global organization of military veterans and allies whose collective efforts build a culture of peace. As Veterans for Peace, we bring a unique and important voice to issues of war and peace. We inform the public of the true causes of war and the enormous costs of war, with an obligation to heal those wounds of war. The Rachel Corrie Chapter in Olympia is one of over 140 chapters worldwide whose work includes educating the public, advocating for dismantling of the war economy, providing services that assist veterans and victims of war, and most significantly, working to end all wars. Each month we present a program focusing on veterans issues, and issues of war and peace. This month's program examines U.S.-North Korea relations and the prospects for an actual end to the state of war that has existed between the two countries since 1950. I'm very pleased to have as my guests two fellow members of the Rachel Corrie Chapter, Larry Kürschner and Dennis Mills. Welcome to you both. And Larry, Dennis, and I have been following the rhetoric, dialogue, and mutual threats exchanged between the U.S. and North Korea since Donald Trump took office as President of the United States. We've had an extended discussion of these issues during our monthly appearances on Chaos Radio's Capital Conversations. This program tonight summarizes the discussions and offers our assessment of future U.S.-North Korea relations. We're recording this program in mid-July 2018 at a time when the U.S. Secretary of State has described relations as good and progressing, and the North Koreans have accused the U.S. of gangster-like demands. One disclosure is that none of us are experts on Korea. We are, however, engaged citizens who have followed the situation closely and have a strong preference for peace and nonviolence. In addition, this topic is special to us because two of our founding members, Bob Petit and Dwayne King, served in Korea, and it brought a lot to our understanding of that war. We also, in addition to this program, we do appear on Capital Conversations with John Ford on Chaos Radio, 89.3 FM, on the fourth Monday of each month from 4 to 5. We also do Veterans Benefit Counseling at the Lacey Veterans Hub on Wednesdays from 1 to 4. And our members participate in the weekly Fellowship of Reconciliation Vigils, one here in Olympia on Friday from 4:30 to 6 o'clock at the Percival Landing, and then also one in Centralia from noon to 1 o'clock at the library. And with that, I'd like to begin with just start out with a little bit of history. Korea is an ancient country, has always been in the shadow of two large nations, and how have they handled that?
Well, if you look at a map, you can see that the Korean Peninsula is almost a bridge between China and Japan. So the whole history of the three countries' interaction with Korea, or with Japan and China, kind of running back and forth, and at different times one was more dominant than the other, and Korea has kind of been the younger brother of the two larger brothers in the area. So their history is caught up in a lot of what has gone on in China and Japan, although they have their own 1,000-year history of and culture on the Korean Peninsula.
I know as I was preparing for this, I did not really know much of Korea's history, and I started reading about it. They always seemed to be dominated by one or the other, and it wasn't until 1910 that they actually, or excuse me, 1895 that they actually established themselves as an independent nation.
I think there were times before that they considered themselves a nation, but in modern times, that's true. 1895, they had a king at that time, and not too long after that, Japan strengthened their influence on Korea, and in 1906, they got the king to abdicate, and he actually started going to school in Japan at their military colleges, and Japan annexed Korea as a, I don't know what they call it, but basically a colony of Japan in 1906.
Yeah, I saw 1910.
1910. Right.
So they had 15 years of
Right.
technical independence.
Right. So.
And you know, Mark, the U.S. has had a presence basically since 1950, when, and I grew up hearing the word police action took place. We didn't call it war then, it was a police action. But there were 16 nations that provided combat forces in Korea, and we've been there ever since. Now, Larry and I were trying to find out how many people are there, you know, and who do you believe, you know? So if our viewing audience Googles it, be aware of where you got the source, because it keeps changing. It's just sort of like in 2003, they said, oh, well, there's 174 bases. And now what's the term that we're figuring out?
Well, it partly depends on how you define a base, the size of the base. There's an excellent book by David Vines called Base Nation, which talks about U.S. military bases all around the world, and he goes into in depth how bases are defined. I wanted to back up just a little bit from what you were saying. The U.S., when the bombs dropped in Japan in August of 1945, the U.S. had no military on the Korean Peninsula.
So we were not involved in Korea at all.
We were not,
to that time.
and Russia had just entered the war in the Pacific a few weeks prior to that, and Roosevelt and Stalin and Churchill, those guys had a meeting where they divided up who was going to control the world, and the agreement between the U.S. and Russia was they were going to have a protectorate similar to what ended up in Berlin, where they had their sphere of influence. So the Russians came down through Manchuria and stopped at the 38th parallel, as they had agreed to, but there were no military in the south of Korea. So the Korean people created a Korean people's government. They had a constitution similar to ours, a little more liberal than the United States Constitution.
And was this just in the southern portion?
No, it was the whole north and south. It was one country. There wasn't a southern.
So even the part that was occupied by Soviet troops.
Right, and they had no problems with it. This government was based on community organizations and unions and people that got together and talked about the type of government they wanted. So that went on for about 6 or 8 weeks before the U.S. troops finally landed in South Korea, and they immediately declared that government illegal. And in the process between 1945 and 1948, they were responsible for the death of 100,000 South Koreans, union organizers, different people like that.
The American forces? American
forces or Republic of Korea forces directed by the Americans. And they killed 40,000 on Jeju Island, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So that there was supposed to be, I think there was an agreement in Geneva that there was supposed to be an election to decide the government of both, and Eisenhower, like happened in Vietnam, they didn't allow the election to happen, so there was this dichotomy, and if you think back, the U.S.'s idea about how the world was going to be was based on the idea that China was going to be run by Chiang Kai-shek.
Yes.
But when Mao Zedong took over in '49, suddenly Korea became the bulwark against the rising tide of godless communism. And so it changed our plans for that part of the world. So then in 1950, you know, ultimately there was the Korean War.
And actually,
which you were talking about.
and before that, even though it was supposedly the bulk, our, I guess, bulwark against communism, the Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, had kind of said, it's not part of our concern. They seem to write it out.
Right.
And it's often...
And then at first, I think, you know, until Mao Zedong took over China, it wasn't. I mean, because they expected that China was going to be the bulwark against Russia.
And then
surprise,
dominance.
yeah, exactly.
And then in 1950, the war broke out.
Right.
And you know, my history says the North Koreans invaded. And when we were talking earlier, you said, well, not...
If Bruce Cummins is a history, an expert on the history of Korea, and reading some of his books, there's apparently evidence that suggests that the South actually started what eventually turned into the war. For about a whole year there, the troops in the South were going across the border north, and the troops in the North were coming south. So there was a lot of conflict on both sides. So it's a little unclear as to who actually started the war.
But there was an invasion that pushed the Republic of Korea and troops, and I guess were there any U.S. troops at that point? I don't think there were.
Well, there probably were. I don't think it was a significant number, though, because
But the communist forces pushed the Korean forces
ROK troops down
really
south,
far south into a small perimeter.
Right.
And Douglas MacArthur landed and then pushed them all the way back up to China, almost, and the Chinese came in and pushed everything back to about the 38th parallel.
Right, so they ended up where they started.
And it was a brutal war.
Yeah.
I don't know if you most recently saw that the war photographer David Duncan recently died, and he has a classic photograph of a Marine commander, 1,000-yard stare, just being informed that he's not going to get any more food, he's not going to get any more ammunition when he's surrounded, and it's like hopeless.
Yeah, it was a brutal war.
Yeah.
You know, that's one of the reasons I watched all the reruns of MASH, because although there was some humor in that, there was an awful lot of political truths that were being expressed at the time. We don't hear that as much today, but that was all in the theater of Korea.
And of course that was used as a commentary on Vietnam. And of course Korea was somewhat, if not a template for Vietnam, one of the first, I guess, hot spots in the Cold War.
It was one of the first overwhelming Air Force dominance through bombing. There were more bombs dropped on North Korea that hadn't been dropped in all of the theaters during the Second World War. And in fact, in some other reading that I had done, there were I think 23 people who were hung after the Nuremberg trials. So there was a lot of criminals, but only 23 were judged bad enough to hang. And one of them was the guy who was in charge of the Netherlands, and he caused the dikes to be broken, so the water came in and ruined the farmland and caused starvation because there wasn't enough food. So he was hung, and 2 years later, the United States was bombing Toksin Dam in North Korea just before the spring planting.
And flooding the rice.
Flooding the rice and killing lots of people and doing exactly the same thing that they had hung somebody for just a few years before. So it's estimated that we killed about 2 million people in North Korea. One of the reasons that we bombed them so heavily was when you think of Korea as one country, when the Japanese were controlling it in the 30s and 40s, all of the heavy industry was in the north. Pyongyang was was where the manufacturing was done. And the economy of the North was much stronger than the economy of the South. So that's one of the reasons why we were bombing so heavily, was to destroy their industrial infrastructure. But
you know, there was a terrible toll of civilians, both North and South. And, you know, we still have over 7,700 American soldiers still unaccounted for, and that was one of the things that, you know, they were trying to negotiate with North Korea, is
Right.
returning the remains.
And that's been an ongoing issue since 1953, since the armistice.
Right.
They do it just a few every so often, but it seems to always to be a bargaining chip. One other thing about that is because of the heavy bombing, and I think at one point the Air Force said there's nothing left to bomb.
right, exactly.
It was so overwhelming. I mean, that has left the deep impression on the North Koreans that the United States is evil. They're the enemy. And the Kim family have used that over the years to harden their citizens against the United States. So now that there's actually some opening in the United States, that's got to be kind of a cognitive dissonance within the Korean society.
Well, and then North Korea's watched what we did with Iraq.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's sort of like, well, we're certainly losing our bargaining positions if you take a look at what we've done.
Mm-hmm. And then we always think about the Korean War being over. I never really thought about that too much until recently, and someone pointed out, no, that's just an armistice. It's not the end of the war. They called it an armistice of World War I in 1918, but they didn't come up with a peace treaty to end the war for another year or so. So here we've got 65 years since...
Yeah, it's technically the longest war that the United States has been in.
So we've been in a state of war with them the whole time,
Right.
and certainly been at odds with them. And we've dealt with 3 generations now of the Kim family. Yeah. And the origin of the family is like Kim Il-sung was he was the anti-Japanese leader during
Right.
World War I or World War II, and was also a communist. And he became the leader in the North, and his family has established that. So it's really a family, I guess, a very family dynasty.
Right. He was a really popular leader.
Yeah.
Again, in Vietnam, they wouldn't allow the election because Ho Chi Minh would have been elected. Well, the same thing would have happened in Korea. Kim probably would have been elected because he was a popular revolutionary figure among the people.
So he earned those chops.
Yeah, and you know, later it became the dictatorship that it is. But initially, he was a hero of the people. So there's so many what ifs. What if we had gone this way or that in American history? What kind of world would we have today?
Different, maybe,
Yeah.
or maybe the same, but differently.
Yeah.
So we've dealt with the same family over the years, and there has been some patterns in this. I mean, we've approached them for some things. You mentioned the repatriating bodies, and every so often they release a few. They're talking about it now, but interesting aspect of the Trump Kim Jong-un agreement is that they would agree to repatriate bodies, and in fact, Donald Trump has said 200 have been repatriated. The Department of Defense has not received them, has no record of that, but he's claimed they had. And today, or yesterday, there was a meeting at the DMZ between U.S. and North Korean representatives on repatriation, and the North Koreans did not show. So it kind of makes you wonder, well, how much of this is actually taking place and what will happen? We've also tried dealing with the North Koreans. They started their nuclear program somewhere, I think it was the mid to late 80s. Mm-hmm. And one of the articles I read that said the reason they did that is they saw what happened in Grenada when the United States went in and just overthrew the government of Grenada. I think it was Kim Il-jung. I forgot which Kim was in charge at that point, but they thought, well, if they can do that so easily, maybe we need a deterrent. And that's when they started. And up until that time, I don't know how much attention we paid to Korea. Every so often there was an incident that would be ugly. I can think of a few ambushes and one lieutenant who was killed by an axe-wielding North Korean soldier. But it was really off the radar. And it's once they started doing nuclear that we started paying attention. And of course, it's continued. There have been 2 attempts, I guess, before the current one to stop their nuclear development. So one was the 1994 agreement, and that was between the U.S. and North Korea. I think you had mentioned that.
Yeah, President Clinton actually was ready to fly to Pyongyang to sign an agreement with them.
And he would have met with the North Korean leader.
He would have met with the North Korean leader, but that was the exact time when the Supreme Court was trying to decide whether they were going to make baby Bush the president, and Clinton didn't feel like he could leave the country with everything so up in the air. So that agreement didn't happen, and as soon as Bush came in, they repudiated all of the agreements that had been made. So that was another lost opportunity.
And then in 2005, there was what was the six-party agreement. So, like we did with Iran, a group of nations got together to come and work up some kind of understanding and agreement with North Korea on nuclear development.
Right.
And again, that was dropped after a short period of time.
Well, I think part of the problem, I mean, the news that you hear here, it sounds like it's always North Korea's fault, but I think part of that agreement was that we were going to provide light water reactors to North Korea, and we never did that.
I think Congress refused.
Right. So again, it was an instance in which why should North Korea believe anything that we say if whatever we agree to, we don't follow up? They could look at the world and they could see what happened to Libya when they gave up their nuclear weapons. They could see what happened to Iraq when they gave up their nuclear weapons, and how the United States treated those people.
Well, and the United States threatened to use nuclear weapons against Korea at one time.
Right.
You know,
yeah. MacArthur wanted to bomb all the way to in fact, he wanted to bomb China.
Right. Seemed to think escalating the war would be a good idea, even though he was the one who said never get involved in a land war in Asia.
Right. Yeah.
But apparently he didn't.
Well, and you know, there's been all kinds of interactions, even with cyber attacks from both Korea and the United States. We shut down their internet, you know. Well, then they attacked Sony Pictures, you know. So there's been a lot of provocations going on for
both
years
sides,
now.
yeah.
Both sides, yeah.
And of course, this is all taking place in a very economically poor country.
Right.
I saw an estimate of their gross national product, and it's something like $3 to $5 trillion. South Korea's is 153 trillion. So it's very different.
And at the time of the Korean War, it was just the opposite. The North was the wealthy part. The South was just farmers. So.
Any idea what accounts for that difference? Or?
Well, in large part, investment. You know, Marshall Plan type investment from the U.S.
into South
Japan,
Korea.
into South Korea, right? And so we created the puppet government there. I mean, I don't know if you remember when we came in and declared that people's government illegal. We took a doctor who was living in a Maryknoll place in Maryland. I think it was a
monastery or convent.
Syngman Rhee, and we put him in charge. And the government that he created, most of the people that had the various functions in his government were Koreans who had collaborated with the Japanese while they were running the country. And the so-called legislature that we allowed them to have, the American general in charge appointed 50% of the people, and the other 50% could be elected, but he had the veto power. If he didn't like them, he would knock them off. So it wasn't until 1979 till Korea, for the first time, had an independent person elected to their government, to run their government. And that's when they started opening up to the North of the possibility of reuniting the country. I mean, when I was there, all the polls showed that over 80% of the people, the main thing they all wanted was to reunite the North and the South, because families had been divided for no reason.
Now, Larry, you mentioned you've been to Korea twice.
Yeah.
What were the attitudes that you picked up? You know, you were coming in as more of a peace-oriented candidate, but What feelings did you pick up from the people you talked to of the attitudes towards the United States?
The first time I went was in 2006, and that was the time that Rumsfeld had decided that they were doing a reorganization of the military around the world, and part of it was to move the troops who were in Seoul far enough south that they couldn't be hit by the artillery from North Korea, because it's a really small country. And that entailed increasing the size of Camp Humphreys. Camp Humphreys was a base that was started by the Japanese in the 30s. It was a good place. It had a river. It had a mesa, where a good airport. So the Japanese had started a base there. And then when the U.S. came in, in '52, they doubled the size of the Japanese base, and they kicked a bunch of rice farmers off their land, didn't give them anything. So when Rumsfeld made this move, they decided to triple the size of Camp Humphreys, and they put about 3,000 rice farmers off their land. Again, no compensation or anything. So that's, I was part of a Veterans for Peace delegation in 2006, and we went there to stand in solidarity with those farmers who were getting screwed by the U.S. And so most of the people that I interacted with were people who didn't have high opinion of the United States because of what was happening. And that wasn't too long after there had been an incident where two guys, military, had run over a 12-year-old girl with a Jeep, and they weren't brought to justice, and there were a lot of incidents of rape and different things because...
Is that tied to the status of forces?
As I was going to say, whenever the U.S. enters in this kind of a situation, they have a status of forces agreement, which essentially says that the U.S. military is not subject to local law.
They'll take care of their own.
Well, and we've polluted their land so much with all of our products there that their water is undrinkable, and the land is not useful for farming in many areas.
Yeah, a small corollary to that was the reason we don't have big bases in Iraq was they refused to sign a status of forces agreement because they said if U.S. troops are going to be there, they're going to be subject to local law.
And we left.
And we left. So, so that was 2006, and needless to say, the U.S. did what they wanted, and they took the people's land and increased the size of the base, and it's just now apparently coming to full fruition as far as how big it has become.
And they claim up to 45,000 or so people could possibly be housed there?
Yeah, it's one of the largest.
45,000 American troops?
One of the largest bases in the world, U.S. military bases.
And Korea has always been considered a combat zone throughout my lifetime.
Well, and we use the term base, and Larry and I were negotiating, is sort of like, how do you define, we say, how do you define denuclearization, but how do you define a base? Yeah. Who owns the base? Who runs the base? At one time they said there was maybe 173 bases. And now there's maybe 30.
If you Google it, you'll find 15 to 30. But again, it depends on the definition of the base, the size, because small outposts could be called a base under some definitions. That's why I recommend David Vine's book, because he talks about that. So in 2014, I went with a group of Catholic workers to Jeju Island. Again, this is Jeju Island was considered radical in Korean history. There's a lot of
that region.
That region, was considered red. It's a large island off the south coast of South Korea, and the next thing is Japan. So it's right there, and the ROK troops under the direction of the United States military bombarded the people of Jeju Island in 1948 because they wouldn't agree to be governed by the government.
Oh, you mean bombarded as in attacked them?
As in attacked, and killed 40,000 of them. There's a museum on the island documenting it. But anyway, so the Korean Navy, supposedly the Korean Navy, decided they needed to put a naval base on Jeju Island, and they tried to put it in two villages, and in both of those villages the people said no. So they came to Gangjeon village in the middle of the night and made some agreements with some politicians, and the people in Gangjeon woke up the next day and found that they were going to be blessed with this naval base. And Gangjeon is a village of about 17 or 1,800 people who are mostly fishermen, fishers, men and women. And the base that was going to be built there is capable of housing 15,000 troops. And the bays were huge. They destroyed a bunch of, they destroyed a UN recognized habitat area of soft coral. They destroyed that to open it up. There was a ancestrally spiritual place called Gorambi Rocks. They went in there with jackhammers and destroyed it. And so the people in the village for years were fighting this from happening, and ultimately, they were overwhelmed by the Korean government, and the base was built and it's open now. And they were saying that it was going to be a Korean Navy base, but in my reading, the largest submarine that the Korean Navy had was like 53 meters, and the sub bays in this base are 300 meters. It happens to be the size of a Trident submarine. So the people are still fighting it, but the village there has been so overwhelmed by this military presence.
I mean, they've actually done the construction.
It's done and it's open as a base.
Completed now.
Yeah, they're having, in fact, about 2 weeks ago, there was demonstrations of the people there who were protesting that there was going to be I think 14 nation, some kind of bring all your ships and show off thing at the base. So the U.S. was going to have big, ships in there, and Australia, and so it's all part of the pivot to Asia to try to control China. I mean, it's obviously what it is. It's right there near the South China Sea, where all of the traffic, the water traffic that goes to China goes right by there.
So we've essentially replaced Japan as that other contending power in that region.
Right. Well, although Japan is, we're encouraging Japan to be a regional power too. I mean, you remember Trump said he doesn't know why Japan doesn't have nuclear weapons. So
maybe because he doesn't read history.
And how far is Jeju Island from, say, the threat of North Korea and all the
I can't give you the number of miles, but the Korean Peninsula is not very big.
No.
It's not very far.
But this is somewhat to the south of the peninsula.
Yeah, this is a large island off the south coast of South Korea.
So it might be beyond where. What was the base you talked about that was moved?
Humphreys, yeah.
Humphreys,
it's south of Humphreys, yeah.
And they moved basically all that because they knew that the artillery, mortars, and whatnot could affect America. I remember the threats that we have. Our servicemen are there. We got to protect them. Well, they've moved those all, further in.
But still a large portion of the South Korean population is within range.
Still
of course, yeah, they didn't care about the South Korean people. There was a UN charter on landmines a number of years ago.
Of landmines?
Prohibition of landmines. The United States is one of the only countries that didn't sign it.
Wouldn't sign it.
Because we have millions of landmines on the border between North and South Korea, and we didn't want to remove them.
So we had a long history of keeping the two Koreas separate.
Right.
And
yeah.
Even though it sounds like when you mentioned the polls that you saw.
Yeah, the people want to be one country, and in fact, just yesterday, I think, the President Moon, who's the current president of South Korea, said that is intention of his administration to end the war by the end of this year and continue the inter-Korea talks that are going on and the work that's going on between North and South Korea. And it has nothing to do with the United States. It has to do with the future of the Korean people.
Can the two Koreas end the war on their own, or is the United States party to all this?
You know, like he said earlier, it was a police action, so I don't know who the armistice. I think the armistice must have been between the UN and
because we were acting under UN auspices.
Right.
Yes.
But regardless of that, I'm sure that North and South Korea can declare that there's no longer a war between the two of them, and then figure out what their future is going to be.
And the United States would have to figure out what our future would be in that environment.
Well, and I know today we're still sending U.S. military personnel to Korea, all over Korea, both the Navy, the Air Force, the Army, Marines.
Right. Well, you know, one of the positive things that Trump did was he publicly said that the war games that we've been doing 2 or 3 times a year for how many years were provocative and needed to stop.
Well, and he used the term war games.
Yeah.
Now, he
exercise.
didn't read his cue very well. He was supposed to say military exercises, but his buddy in the Kremlin said, oh, use the word war games.
Right.
And he did.
Yeah, so that's a positive thing. I mean, I don't have much positive to say about our president, but that is a positive thing, even if he did it inadvertently. There's some hope for the people of Korea to be able to chart their own future. And there was so much negative press in the United States about the summit in Singapore when Trump came back. You know, he gave away the store, and the Democratic leaders were all just up in arms about how awful this was. The people in Korea, I talked to people who are living there, and the people in Korea couldn't understand why the American people were saying this, because they saw it as a positive thing. It wasn't a fait accompli, you know. The agreement was just
They saw
words.
a movement towards,
They saw a possibility of peace in their future.
Like the critics are focusing on, you know, I guess, all the nitty-gritty specifics as opposed to, well, what were they thinking about? Where are they going with this? What do they want?
Right.
I mean, that does seem to be a positive aspect of what Donald Trump has started.
Right.
I think where a lot of the criticism comes in, okay, is that he's, you know, certainly hyped it to the point of a major accomplishment.
He believes something happened that didn't happen.
Right.
That's part of the problem.
In fact, he believes he has a contract.
Right.
He said he doesn't want Kim to break his contract.
Right.
Yeah, he says, I have confidence that Kim Jong-un will honor the contract we signed, and even more importantly, our handshake.
Right. It made me think of, you remember when Bush said that he had looked in Putin's eyes and could see his soul, and it was a good man.
And Trump tweeted then on a Monday, we agree to the denuclearization of North Korea. But again,
what does it mean?
How do you define that term?
Actually, I mean, there are two definitions of denuclearization. We have one that's called certified variable independently evaluated denuclearization. It's called CVID, and that's our version. And then the Korean version is we denuclearize the peninsula, and that includes the nuclear weapons that the United States has. So we're still pretty far away.
Right.
And when all the articles I see, when you talk to American policymakers, they are still using that CVID demand. I saw Chuck Schumer, the Democratic leader, says we must have this. Well, that's a formula for failure, because they're not going to go there.
Right.
At least not right off.
They have no
North
reason
Koreans,
to go there.
Did they agree on paper to no concrete actions? Well, no one has seen that paper.
There's no contract.
Well, and the meeting it was Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un together with no one else there except for interpreters. It was about an hour long, and I read that half of that time was interpreters, so it's like 30 minutes.
Right.
So to give them credit, there's something there, a process moving forward that wasn't there before.
Right, exactly.
But there's really not a whole lot to it yet.
No substance to it, yeah.
And that's what we're supposed to be working out, and what Mike Pompeo was supposed to be doing last week.
Right.
And he didn't get the meeting he wanted, and apparently acted like a gangster.
I read a CNN report. It says, I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding, said the CNN global affairs analyst Joseph Yun. He was a former top U.S. diplomat on North Korea policy. Quote, the U.S. still believes North Korea will denuclearize substantially before we give them any major rewards, while North Korea believes that the two need to move jointly together and both make concessions.
And it seems somewhat unlikely that North Korea is going to say, okay, we will do all this, and then wait for you to give us our reward.
And the U.S. is clearly, I mean, they could look at what Trump did with Iran. We don't keep our word.
Even when we make an agreement.
Exactly, we don't keep our word. So why should they put themselves at risk based on this kind of history? I mean, the only reason that we ended up at the table was because they were able to develop nuclear weapons, and they got a seat at the table. So why would they give up their seat at the table and believe that some fairy dust from us is going to?
And when they fired missiles, and then the United States says, "Oh, well, now we're beginning to see them as a peer,"
Right.
And so they got that seat at the table. You know.
And Trump and his folks, do you remember the first thing that Trump said about his trip there? He talked about how great the beaches were, and wouldn't it be nice to have hotels there? This is a man who builds hotels. I mean, that was his vision.
It was a transaction.
Yeah, exactly.
So I guess what are the likelihoods of anything coming out of it, out of all this?
I think it'll just depend. I think, in a large extent, it'll depend on the North and the South Koreans, because I mean, in reality, they're the one who drove this to begin with. Trump and Pence jumped on the bandwagon about the time of the Olympics, but the North and the South Koreans had already opened this dialogue and started this possibility. So in reality, I think it'll be up to them, the direction that it'll go. And it won't be a simple, easy thing. It'll take a long time. I mean, trying to integrate an economy of this, like the South has, with an economy like the North has. If you think about what happened when East Germany and West Germany tried to go, major problems. It's not something that you can do overnight and do simply. But if your goal is to ultimately become one nation again, there are ways to figure out how to do it.
Yeah.
And as long as the United States doesn't get in the way.
What likelihood is there that the Kim family and the dynasty will be an obstacle? Because they could be at risk.
At risk from?
Of losing power.
Again, we don't know. I mean, you know, the propaganda we hear about the Kim family is that they're all crazy people, pornographers and all this stuff, and you stop and think, how do you know what you think you know about them? You know, it's all propaganda that you've heard. So who knows? Who knows?
And if our viewing audience wanted to really get some scoop on what's happening with the Koreas, what sources would you even recommend today that at least would give conflicting, if not, you know, informative views?
Well, there's a number of Korean newspapers that have English editions that are available online. I mean, that's one way.
And there are a variety of independent sources online.
Right.
I have not read too many of specifically.
Nation magazine has had several good stories on what's going on in Korea. So I mean, you have to seek them out and not get all of your information from CNN or Fox or.
And even some of the mainstream media are pointing out that the North Koreans are not crazy people.
Right.
That they're actually strategic thinkers and might be far more strategic than Donald Trump. That they do have a set of goals: preserving the regime, enhancing their international position, ending the sanctions, and strengthening their economy.
Right.
I mean, they have
all sensible things.
Mm-hmm. They also have some, they want to control, they have a large prison system, a lot of hard labor. It is a totalitarian society, as we see it. So how do you integrate that with what has become a democratic South Korea?
Right, and that has to be something that the Korean people themselves have to figure out. I mean, you can look at aspects. I mean, the United States has 25% of all the people in the world in prison. So what does that say about a totalitarian system that has prisoners? I mean, a lot of it just depends on your point of view. And the United States, there's a Norwegian historian named Johan Galtung, who in 1980 wrote an analysis of the Soviet Empire. And he predicted that within 10 years, the Soviet Empire would collapse. And it collapsed in 1989. Mm-hmm. And in 2000, he did a similar analysis of the American Empire, and taking all kinds of factors into it. And in 2000, he said that by 2025, the United States empire, American empire, would collapse for a lot of the same reasons. And after 8 years of George Bush, he changed that. And he said by 2020, the American empire would collapse. And I think to some extent, we're seeing that, the early collapse of the empire, because the United States no longer is the automatically listened to on the world stage. And China is the new big kid.
Well,
on the
if they
block.
were to listen to the United States, who are you going to believe one day or the next?
Exactly. So
and we've alienated our allies and congratulated our quote enemies. It's sort of like on a daily basis we turn on the news and it begins to look like a soap opera.
Like the enemy of the day.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when you try to decide what's going to happen, I think it's hard to know. There's so many moving pieces right now, but what I hope happens is that the Korean people are allowed to figure out their own future. And it may not be pretty, it may be tough, but it's their future. It's not our future.
Which would be a real change for the Korean Peninsula.
Yeah.
I mean, they've had
Exactly.
to deal with other countries' view of their future.
Right.
For much of their history.
And they're still going to have to deal with the fact that Japan and China are right there.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they're on the block too, but the United States doesn't have to be on that block.
I was thinking, Mark, one of the sources that our viewing audience could look at was our veteransforpeace.org, and we do have links on Korea. Matter of fact, we even have a chapter of Veterans for Peace, Kim, in Korea.
Yeah, there's, and when I was there for the 2006 meeting, I had come from the National Convention of Veterans for Peace. It was in Seattle that year. And there was a group of retired Korean military people who had formed Korean Veterans for Peace group, and they were at the convention, and that's the reason we went, because they invited us to come. Mm-hmm. So so there is a Korean Veterans for Peace group. It's not considered an official group by the government, but it's there. A recent thing that happened in Korea was that for the first time they've allowed for conscientious objectors to not be in the military, because under law, every 18-year-old man needs to be in the military, but they've just recently, the courts have allowed for conscientious objectors in the Korean system.
Which would be a real change.
Yeah.
And of course, if I recall from Vietnam, the Republic of Korea troops were some of the most I want to say, brutal. They were known for their
Yeah,
fierceness
the tigers, yeah.
and brutality and interrogation techniques.
Which they learned from us.
Of course. And also one of the prospects for peace in the Korean Peninsula is, addressing the nuclear issue. And at the time of the Trump-Kim summit, the International Campaign Against Nuclear Weapons issued a statement, and they're pointing out that there is now a process for denuclearization. They said they've had 5 steps. And the first step is to recognize the task of using nuclear weapons and the unacceptable humanitarian consequences of such use. The second step is to reject the nuclear weapons by joining the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which was adopted by the General Assembly of the United Nations last year. And that would be for both North and South Korea to ratify that treaty. The third is to create a verifiable and time-bound plan for disarmament. And as we were talking before, this is a stage thing. You do one thing, and the other side does something else. You slowly build up the conference. And that's much of what they did in developing the Iran agreement. Right. They worked it out that, okay, we can accept this, we can't accept that, we can move forward. And then the fourth step that ICON refers to is ratifying the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. It's an essential and effective step toward the denuclearization process. And it's pertinent in the verification of the closure of North Korean test sites. And then finally is North Korea should rejoin the Non-Proliferation Treaty and commit to global disarmament. So they laid out a pretty good process. And there's a lot more detail to that on their website, which is, I think, icon.org, but I'm not sure. They also, the ICON chair issued a really good statement. I think it speaks to what is needed. After talking about the 5 steps, she said, "The rest of us don't need to sit around and place our faith in 2 temperamental, ego-driven men. Whether Trump and Kim like it or not, the nuclear ban treaty is a reality, and the sooner it enters into force, the better. Responsible states all around the world must join the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And concerned citizens of the world can tell their elected officials that they expect their governments to take real steps toward a world free of nuclear weapons." So this doesn't really rely on the leaders. It's actually calling on the people to take action. So there are some plans, but as you say, we don't know exactly how it's going to turn out. It's good that we're talking. It seems that we're exaggerating the process and making it overly simple when it is going to be complex.
Right.
Well, and if the talks collapse, Trump has no plan B other than returning to Little Rocket Man and fire and fury threats. Mm-hmm. He doesn't have anything.
And that's why having a process that doesn't involve egos really makes a difference. Right. And actually, there was a letter in the Seattle Times the other day speaking to that, which is, who knows what the result is going to be. But and we should really be thinking more than just the Korean Peninsula. We should be thinking about denuclearizing the world.
There you go.
So, this gets into our nuclear weapons issues, where it's like, why is it the United States can have all these weapons and nobody else can?
Well, and our friend Larry knows all about nuclear weapons close to Seattle.
Yeah, there's 1,000 nuclear weapons at the Bangor submarine base, just 20 miles west of Seattle. The Trident submarines there are, each submarine has 24 D4 missiles on it, and each D4 missile has 8 independently targetable warheads. So one submarine could wipe out 100 cities, and those are on 15-minute alert. Mm-hmm. Just
and
20 miles
west
of Seattle.
And they're not just in Bangor either.
No.
They're spread all out.
There's one that's equal base in Georgia.
In Georgia, slightly smaller base, but same kind of thing.
Yeah.
At Farslane and Scotland.
So when we think about North Korea and its nukes, I mean, that's just one small part of the problem.
Exactly.
So
yeah, I mean, what are there, 10,000 nuclear weapons currently in the world?
Something like
and
that.
Maybe 10 of them are in North Korea. Mm-hmm. So, who are the main culprits in the nuclear weapons situation. I personally think the United States is one of the large culprits. Our nuclear policy is, from my point of view, is illegal under international law, and there have been a few instances in which judges in court matters have agreed to tell the jury that we are in fact committing war crimes with our current policy.
But when you were arrested at Bangor, and I remember going to one of your trials, I mean, they might as well put tape across your lips.
May as well.
Yeah,
You couldn't tell them why you did what you did.
They don't want to hear.
Did you step
the
across the
reality.
line, yes
Right,
or no?
Yeah.
Guilty.
But know why. And I think that really kind of brings us back to a wrap-up, which is, yes, North Korea is an issue. It needs to be dealt with. But there is this larger issue, of which it is part. And that, too, needs to be dealt with. So focusing on that one small effort or one small piece of the puzzle does not get a resolution. So I see we are starting to run out of time. So I want to thank you both for coming in and offering your comments and your thoughts. I really do appreciate that.
Thank you.
It was we've been talking about this all year, so we probably could talk forever. So in closing, I'd like to point out the Veterans for Peace mission statement prominently calls for reducing and eventually eliminating nuclear weapons. The U.S.-North Korea standoff is a dangerous flashpoint, and we hope this program demonstrates the importance of ending the state of war between the U.S. and North Korea that's existed for almost 7 decades. The task requires persistence and patience. As Noam Chomsky said, if you go to one demonstration and then go home, that's something. But the people in power can live with that. What they can't live with is sustained pressure that keeps building, organizations that keep doing things, and people that keep learning the lessons from the last time and doing it better for the next time. Thank you very much for watching.